The morning Della Rhodes arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she had exactly $43, a carpet bag that had seen better decades, and a stubbornness that her late mother had always called either her greatest virtue or her most spectacular flaw, depending on the day and the circumstances surrounding it. She stepped off the Santa Fe Railroad line onto a platform that smelled of coal smoke, horse dung, and the kind of desperate hope that accumulated in frontier towns like sediment at the bottom of a river. The town of Caldwell stretched out before her in that particular way that cattle towns had of looking both temporary and eternal at the same time, as though the buildings had been thrown up in a hurry, but had since decided they weren't going anywhere. The streets were wide enough to turn a full cattle drive through, which was precisely the point, and the dust that lifted off them in small spiraling clouds carried itself through the air with a certain proprietary confidence. Della stood very still for a moment on that platform and looked at all of it with her brown eyes, the ones her father had always said could read a man's intentions like a page from the good book, and she took a long, steadying breath and told herself that she was not afraid. She was afraid. But she was also 24 years old and had come from Missouri after her father's death left her with nothing but a deed to land she'd never seen, land that a cousin in Caldwell had written to tell her about, land that supposedly held a ranch somewhere out in the Flint Hills that her father had acquired in a card game 3 years prior and had never once mentioned to her. She had found the deed folded inside his Bible after the funeral, tucked behind the Book of Ruth, and she had taken that as a sign because her father had always loved signs. The cousin's letter had been short on details and long on warnings. It had said the land was rough country. It had said she would need help. It had said she should not come alone. She had come alone anyway. The first person she asked for directions was a woman sweeping the porch of a dry goods store who looked at Della's city dress and her carpet bag, and the deed in her hand with an expression that mixed sympathy with skepticism in approximately equal measure. The woman told her that if she was looking for help sorting out land claims and ranch property in the territory, there was one man in Caldwell who knew those hills better than anyone still living, and that was Andrew Townsend. The woman said his name the way people in small towns said the names of men who were complicated, which was with a kind of reverence that had something else underneath it, something that suggested the reverence was earned, but the complication was real. Della found Andrew Townsend at the livery stable on the south end of town, and the first thing she noticed about him was that he was arguing with a horse. Not shouting at it, not threatening it, but genuinely arguing in a low and conversational tone, the way a man argues with someone he respects but disagrees with fundamentally. The horse in question was a big roan mare with opinions of her own, and she was expressing those opinions through the strategic positioning of her ears and the deliberate turning of her enormous head away from the man beside her. And Andrew Townsend was telling her, quietly and with great patience, that she was wrong about the situation, and he was right about it, and that she would understand that eventually, and he hoped it would be sooner rather than later because he had things to do. He was tall, lean in the way that came from years of real work rather than careful appetite, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jawline that had been sharpened by weather and time. He wore his work clothes like they belonged on him, which they did, and there was nothing about him that was trying to be anything other than exactly what he was, which Della found immediately disarming in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. She cleared her throat. He turned, and his eyes were the dark blue of deep water in winter, and they took her in with a calm and unhurried attention that she found equally disarming. "Miss," he said. "I'm looking for Andrew Townsend," she said. "You found him," he said. She introduced herself and showed him the deed and explained what she knew, which wasn't much. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which she noted because most men she had known in her life had interrupted with great regularity and even greater confidence. He took the deed from her carefully and read it, and then he looked up at her with those winter-water eyes and said, slowly, Della Rhodes. That's right, she said. Your father was Thomas Rhodes, he said. She felt the small shock of hearing her father's name in this place, so far from the kitchen table in Missouri, where she had last heard it spoken by someone who loved him. He was, she said, keeping her voice steady. Andrew nodded, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name, something thoughtful and careful. I knew your father, he said. Not well, but I knew him. He was a good man. He was, she said again. Andrew handed the deed back to her. He looked at it one more time before he did, and then he looked at her again, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of quiet decision. I can help you find the property, he said, and get it sorted out, see what kind of shape it's in. It's about a day's ride northeast up into the hills. The riding's rough in places. I can ride, she said. He looked at her city dress and her carpet bag, and he had the good sense not to say anything about either of them. I'll need a day to get things arranged, he said. You got a place to stay tonight. She had the $43, which was enough for the hotel, and she told him so. He nodded and told her he'd meet her in front of the hotel at first light the day after tomorrow, and then he turned back to the roan mare as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, which apparently it had. She spent that first night in Caldwell at the hotel, which was clean if not comfortable, lying on a narrow bed listening to the sounds of the cattle town settling into its night routines, the distant music from the saloon, the occasional voice lifted in argument or laughter, the steady and ancient conversation of horses in a corral somewhere nearby. She held the deed in both hands in the dark and thought about her father, who had won a piece of land in a card game and tucked the deed behind the Book of Ruth and never said a word to her about it. And she wondered, not for the first time, what he had been thinking. Whether he had meant it as a gift, or whether he simply hadn't known what to do with it. She liked the idea of the gift. She decided to believe the gift. In the morning, she bought herself proper riding clothes from the dry goods store, because $43 was not much, but it was enough for that. And the woman who had directed her to Andrew Townsend helped her find something suitable and practical, and did not remark on the city dress, which Della appreciated. She also bought a wide-brimmed hat and a pair of boots that fit well enough and would fit better once they were broken in, and she put her hair up under the hat and looked at herself in the small mirror behind the counter, and thought that she looked like someone who might actually belong in this country. She met Andrew Townsend at first light the next morning as agreed. He had 2 horses ready, a sturdy gray for her and his roan mare, whose name he eventually revealed was Cecily, because he had named her after a poem he had read once that he couldn't fully remember but had liked the sound of. He said this with complete seriousness, and without any apparent awareness that it was an unusual thing to admit in the middle of the Kansas territory. Della filed that piece of information away with great care, in that interior place where she kept things that mattered. He had also packed supplies for 2 days in a pair of saddlebags, because the trip out and the trip back were each a day's ride, and in that careful practicality she recognized a man who thought ahead and took care, which was more than she could say for a number of men she had known. They rode out of Caldwell as the sun was clearing the horizon to the east and turning the flat land to gold, and for the first hour they didn't talk much, which suited Della fine because she was occupied with the business of riding and with looking at the landscape, which was unlike anything she had grown up with. The Flint Hills of Kansas were their own particular kind of beautiful, long sweeping rises and valleys covered in bluestem grass that moved in the wind like something breathing, and the sky above them was enormous and active, full of the kind of clouds that formed out here, where nothing interrupted the relationship between earth and atmosphere. It was a landscape that demanded something of you, a willingness to be small inside it, and Della found that she didn't mind that, which surprised her. Andrew rode beside her and let her look. He seemed to understand without being told that she needed that quiet to take the country in, and he gave it to her without making her ask for it. Eventually she asked him how long he had been in Caldwell. 7 years, he said. She asked where he had come from before that. Virginia, originally, he said. Then a few years of wandering around. Texas for a while. I ended up here because the cattle drives came through and there was work, and then the work became something else, and here I am. What's the something else? She asked. He thought about it for a moment in that way he had of actually thinking about things before he said them. I know this country well enough that people hire me to help them navigate it. Land claims, property disputes, trail finding. Sometimes I help ranchers move cattle. Sometimes I help families find the land they bought that nobody told them where it was. He paused. That last one happens more than you'd think. I imagine it does, she said. They were quiet again for a while. The grass moved around them and the sky was very blue, and a hawk was working a thermal high above, tilting its wings with that particular economy of movement that made it look effortless. Did you know my father well? She asked. I met him twice, he said. Once when he came through Caldwell 4 years back, and once about 2 years later when he came back to look at the land he'd won. He didn't end up getting out there that second time. Something came up that took him back east. But he stood right where you're riding now and looked out toward those hills and said that it was beautiful country, and he hoped someday someone would make something of it. Della felt the grief move through her in the way it had been doing since her father's death, in waves that caught her off guard and receded and came back when she didn't expect them. She let it move through her and kept her face toward the horizon. He was right, she said. It is beautiful. Andrew looked at her then, just briefly, and the look had something in it that she didn't try to read yet. They made camp that evening in a sheltered spot where a limestone outcropping made a natural windbreak, and a shallow creek ran nearby, cold and clear over flat stones. Andrew built a fire with the casual competence of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and Della found that she wasn't useless around a fire herself, having grown up with a father who had taken her camping along the Missouri River more times than she could count. She helped without being asked, and he accepted the help without making a comment about it either way, and that easy working silence between them felt natural and good in a way that she hadn't expected to feel this far from home. He made coffee and they ate the food he had packed, which was simple and sufficient, and they sat on either side of the fire and watched the dark come down over the hills. The stars out here were something different from the stars in Missouri, or maybe she had just never paid enough attention before, but they seemed closer and more numerous, spread across the sky with a kind of wild generosity. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure, he said. Why are you helping me? She said. You don't know me. You knew my father barely at all. I have $40 and a deed to a piece of land that might be worthless, and you've packed 2 days of supplies and taken time away from whatever else you do. I want to understand the reason. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire and then at the hills beyond it, dark and breathing in the night. Your father, he said slowly, when I met him that second time, was a man who was very sick and very aware of it. He didn't say so directly, but I'd spent enough time with enough men to know what that look was. And he stood out here and looked at this land, and I could see him working something out in his mind, something about what would happen to it, and whether it would go to waste. He said, casual-like, that he had a daughter back in Missouri who was the most capable person he had ever known. Said it just like that, the most capable person he'd ever known. And then he went quiet, and I could see that it cost him something to think about her and be this far away. Andrew looked up at her from across the fire. So when you walked into that livery stable with his deed and his name, it felt like something I was supposed to do, like a thing I could finish for him that he couldn't finish himself. Della looked at him for a long time. The fire was between them and it lit his face from below, and his eyes were serious and straightforward, and she believed him entirely. Thank you for telling me that, she said. It's the truth, he said. They were quiet after that for a comfortable while, and then they talked about other things, smaller things, the kind of conversation that happens between two people who are finding out whether they are comfortable with each other, and discovering, with some mutual surprise, that they are. He told her about the cattle drives he'd worked, The great herds that had come up through the Kishom Trail in the years before the Kansas quarantine laws started cutting that route off. The extraordinary spectacle of 10,000 cattle moving across the land as a single breathing mass. She told him about Missouri and her father's general store, and the way she had grown up knowing every customer by name and knowing which ones would pay, and which ones would need a little extra time, and that knowing had been its own education. He laughed at a story she told about a customer who had tried to trade a rooster for a month's worth of flour, and the laugh was genuine and warm and changed his whole face, and she noticed that too. She fell asleep to the sound of the creak and the fire, and found that she slept well. They reached the property by midday the next day, coming up over a long rise of bluestem grass, and finding below them a valley that opened like a hand, sheltered on three sides by low limestone ridges, and crossed by a creek that was wider and stronger than the one they had camped by. There was a house on the near edge of the valley, small but solid, built from limestone blocks that matched the ridges around it, with a roof that was intact and a porch that needed some repair but was not beyond it. There was a barn in better shape than the house, and several acres of fencing that were still standing and straight, and beyond that the land opened into grass that was exactly what it was supposed to be: grazing land, good deep grass over good deep soil, the kind that could support a real herd. Della stopped her horse at the top of the rise and looked down at all of it with her hand shading her eyes against the noon sun. "This is it," she said. "According to the deed," he said, "this is it." She looked at it for a long time, the house with its stone walls and its intact roof, the barn, the fencing, the grass and the creek and the ridges making a shelter of the valley, keeping the worst of the wind off and the water in. "It's not worthless," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She turned to look at him and found him watching her with something carefully contained in his expression, and she had the sudden feeling that he had known this, had known what was down there and had said nothing and let her discover it herself, and she wasn't sure yet how she felt about that. "You've been out here before," she said. "Once," he said. "About 6 months ago. Man in town asked me to check on some properties in the area for him. This one was on the list. So you knew what was here." "I had an idea," he said, and his tone was careful and honest at the same time. She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked back at the valley and the house and the grass and the sky above all of it, and what she felt was so large and complicated that she couldn't name it all at once. There was the grief for her father, who had won this place, and never told her about it but had left it to her anyway, like a message written in a language she had only just learned to read. There was the overwhelm of the landscape and the size of what she was looking at, what it might mean if she could make it work. And underneath all of that there was the warm and unfamiliar sensation of being looked after without being managed, helped without being handled, which was something she had not experienced often and which she recognized as precious and rare. They rode down into the valley together. The house was dusty but not deteriorated. Someone had closed the shutters at some point, which had kept the worst of the weather out, and the limestone walls were thick and well-made, and the floor was solid wood that just needed a good cleaning. The fireplace was large and well-built. The windows, when she opened the shutters on them, let in great squares of prairie light that fell on the dusty floor like something being offered. She walked through every room, which was 3 of them, a main room with the fireplace and a kitchen area, and 2 smaller rooms off the back, and Andrew walked behind her and let her do it in her own time. He ran his hand along the mantel and checked the chimney draw and told her what needed doing, and what didn't need doing, and how long things would take. And she listened and made a mental inventory. And by the time they had walked the property and come back to the porch, she had a plan forming in her mind that was rough around the edges but real. "I want to make this work," she said. She was standing on the porch looking out at the valley and the grass. "I know I don't know ranching, I know I don't have much, but I want to try." "I know," he said. He was leaning against the porch post, arms crossed, looking at the same view she was looking at. "Can you help me?" she said. "Not the way you've been helping, as a favor to my father's memory. I mean going forward. I'd pay you what I could, which isn't much right now, but the land is worth something, and as it develops I could pay more. I need someone who knows this territory and knows cattle and knows how these things work." She paused. "I'm asking for a business arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the valley and then at her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, and his voice was level, but there was something in it underneath the level, something that was aware of more than just the business arrangement, and she felt that awareness like a warmth across the space between them. They rode back to Caldwell the next day, and over the weeks that followed, Andrew Townsend came back to the valley with her again and again, and the business arrangement became something harder to name. He knew everyone in the territory worth knowing. He knew which suppliers in Caldwell were honest, and which ones would price gouge a woman alone, and he steered her toward the honest ones without making a speech about it. He helped her get the house in order, working alongside her on the days he came out, and she discovered that he was the kind of man who worked not to be seen working, but because things needed doing and he was there to do them. He fixed the porch and replaced 2 window frames and helped her hang a new door on the barn. And she held things and handed things and worked beside him, and the easiness of working together continued from the first evening by the campfire, and grew into something that felt necessary. He helped her purchase her first small herd of cattle, a dozen head from a rancher 20 miles north who was scaling down, and he negotiated the price with a directness that got her a fair deal without being combative about it, and she watched how he did it and stored the lesson away. She was storing a great many lessons away in those weeks, lessons about cattle and land and fencing and water rights, and the particular social geography of a frontier town, which people carried weight and which ones were loudest without substance. She also, in those weeks, was storing away a great many things about Andrew Townsend that had nothing to do with business. She stored away the way he drank his coffee, black and too hot, standing up, as if sitting down to drink coffee was a luxury he hadn't quite given himself permission for yet. She stored away the books she found in his saddlebag one afternoon when she was looking for a water skin, dog-eared paperbacks, and a small volume of poetry with notes written in the margins in his cramped handwriting. She stored away the fact that he always spoke to the neighboring families they encountered with the same respect he gave the ranchers with money, and that he had quietly helped a Pawnee family who had been pushed off their traditional land and had ended up near the edge of her valley make a more secure arrangement with the county, doing it without fanfare or self-congratulation, just because it was the right thing, and he was in a position to help. She stored away the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, not with the appraising and proprietary way some men looked at women, as if cataloging assets. With something quieter and more careful than that, something that had in it a kind of wondering, as if she kept being something slightly more than he had expected and he was still catching up. She thought about telling him she noticed. She thought about it and didn't, because there was a particular pleasure in having something unspoken between 2 people who are both fully aware of it, a taut and beautiful tension, and she was not ready to release it yet. The summer came on hot and full, the way Kansas summers do, with a heat that was different from Missouri heat because the wind was always in it, and the sky was always enormous, and the light had a particular quality of unmediated intensity, as if between the sun and the land there were no negotiations taking place. Della had cattle to tend and fencing to maintain, and a house to keep and a garden she had planted along the south side of the house that was coming in surprisingly well for land that had been untouched for years. She worked hard and went to bed tired and woke up before sunrise and did it all again and found, to her own profound surprise, that she was happy. Not the quiet contentment kind of happy that she had known back in Missouri, a life that was functional and full enough, but that had always carried in it a sense of waiting for something she couldn't name. This was the other kind of happy, the kind that had substance and texture to it, the kind that felt earned and real and located in a specific place and a specific life that was hers and no one else's. Some of that happiness, she knew, had a specific origin point that was not the land or the cattle or the garden. It had dark hair that needed cutting and winter water eyes, and a habit of arguing quietly with horses and reading poetry, with the margins filled in. She was aware that she was falling in love with Andrew Townsend in the way that you become aware of weather that has been building for a while, not as a sudden revelation, but as the recognition of something that has already been true for some time. He came out to the ranch 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes to work, sometimes just to check in, and the line between those categories had grown porous. Some afternoons they sat on the porch after a day's work and talked until the sun was fully down and the stars were out, and those conversations ranged wide and deep in the way that conversations between two people who trust each other will. He told her about Virginia and his family, a father who had been stern and difficult and had died during the war years when Andrew was still young, a mother who had been the steadier force and who had eventually come west herself, and was living now in Colorado with a sister. He told her about the years of drifting after the war reshaped everything, how the West had offered a kind of starting over that the East could not, how he had taken that offer and built something out of himself that he felt reasonably good about. She told him about her mother's death when Della was 16, and how she had stepped into the role of keeping the household going alongside her father, and how that had given her a capability she was grateful for even though the cost of it had been a childhood that ended earlier than it should have. She told him about the young men she had not married, several of whom had tried, and why she had not married them, which was not that they were bad men but that something in her had been waiting, even when she hadn't known she was waiting, for something particular that she couldn't have described but would know. She told him that last part and then felt the weight of the silence after it, and looked at the darkening hills and was aware of him beside her on the porch steps with the length of his arm almost touching hers. He said, very quietly, "I think I know what you mean." The moment hung between them, perfectly balanced, and she felt her heart doing something complicated, and she didn't move and neither did he. And eventually the moment resolved itself not into anything said, but into him handing her the last of the coffee from the pot, and their hands touching in the transfer and both of them being very aware of that touch without saying so. It was a Friday evening in late July when everything shifted. Della had spent the day mending fence along the eastern edge of her property, where one of her cattle had found a weak spot and pushed through, and she had been working in the heat for hours and was tired and dusty and satisfied in the way that physical work leaves you when it goes well. She was washing up at the pump beside the house when she heard a horse coming up the valley track and turned to see Andrew riding in, and there was something different about the way he was riding, something less of his usual unhurried ease, and she straightened up and waited. He dismounted and tied Cecily to the post and looked at Della with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, one that was clearly wrestling with something. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. He pulled his hat off and held it in both hands, which she had learned was something he did when he was working through a thing he found difficult. "I told you I'd been out to your property before I met you," he said. "About 6 months ago, checking properties for a man in town." "I remember," she said. "I didn't tell you is that the man I was checking for was a land agent named Decker who had been making inquiries about several properties in the area, including yours. He was looking for properties that were unoccupied and had unclear title situations that he might be able to move on. There are men who do that, find claims where the original holder is absent or deceased, and work the legal system to absorb those properties." Della went very still. "Was he trying to take my father's land?" "He was evaluating it," Andrew said. "When I rode out there and saw the property, saw what kind of shape it was in, what the land was worth, I reported back to Decker and I told him the title was clear and the claim was solid and there was nothing to move on." He paused. That was not entirely accurate. The claim was solid, but there were some technical questions about the filing that someone motivated could have used to make trouble. I chose not to mention those questions. Della looked at him steadily. Why? Because the property belonged to Thomas Rhodes and after him to whoever he left it to, and that was the truth of it, and the legal technicalities were a way around the truth, not the truth itself. He met her eyes. I didn't know then that you existed or that you'd be coming. I just knew it wasn't right to hand that information to Decker. Is Decker still a threat? She said. That's the other thing I need to tell you, Andrew said. He came to see me this week. He's heard that the Rhodes property is being developed now, and that's made him interested again. He's been asking around about the title situation. Della set down the cloth she'd been using to dry her hands and looked at him with full and focused attention. What can he actually do? Andrew told her, cleanly and without softening it, about the technical gap in the land filing, which had to do with a required secondary recording in the county records that her father had never completed, probably because he had not stayed in Kansas long enough to do so, probably because no one had told him it was required. On its own, it was not enough to truly invalidate her claim, but it was enough for a lawyer and a motivated land agent to create a legal complication that could drag on for months and cost her money she didn't have. Can it be fixed? She said. Yes, he said. I already started fixing it. I went to the county recorder's office on Monday and filed the supplementary documentation on your behalf. It needs your signature and a small fee that I covered, and when you go in to sign it, it will be complete. The window for Decker to use that gap will be closed. She stared at him. You already did that. Yes, he said, without telling me first. I should have told you first, he said. I wanted to get it done before Decker could move, and I moved fast, and I should have come to you before I did. I'm telling you now because you deserve to know all of it, the part I didn't tell you 6 months ago and the part I fixed this week. He looked at her with those straightforward eyes. I didn't do any of it to manage things for you. I did it because I thought it was right, and then I did it too fast. I'm sorry for the part that was mine to apologize for. There was a long moment in which the evening light lay across the valley in its unhurried way, and a meadowlark somewhere nearby was making its particular and lovely noise, and Della looked at Andrew Townsend and thought about all the things he had done and not told her, and the things he had done and was telling her now, and the distinction between those categories. You could have made this about yourself, she said slowly. The whole thing. A man helps a woman alone on the frontier, protects her land from a scheming developer, fixes the legal problems. You could have made that into something where you were the center of it and I owed you. I didn't want it to be like that, he said quietly. I know, she said. That's exactly my point. She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at the valley, at the grass and the house and the barn and the cattle she could see as small shapes in the last light out in the far pasture. You let me find this place, she said. You knew what was down in this valley, and you let me ride up to the top of that rise and see it for myself. You've been here twice a week all summer, and you've worked alongside me, and you've helped me learn what I need to learn, and you have never once made it feel like I needed rescuing. He was quiet. And now you're telling me about the Decker situation and the title fix and the whole history of it, she said, and you're not making it into something that puts me in your debt. You're just telling me because I should know. She turned to look at him directly. Andrew. Yes, he said. Thank you, she said. For all of it, including the parts you should have told me about sooner. He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding without knowing he was, and his expression changed in that way it did when something unwound in him, going from the careful management of it to something more open and unguarded. You're not angry, he said. I'm a little bit in the right direction of angry about the title business, she said. You should have told me when you found out Decker was asking questions. I can handle difficult information. I know you can, he said immediately. But I also understand that you acted fast because the situation was time-sensitive and your intentions were right, she said. So I'm registering the complaint and moving on. He laughed, short and genuine, and she smiled at him, and the thing that had been building and building between them for weeks was very close to the surface now. She could feel it in the air between them, like the particular charged feeling before a summer storm. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make supper, and you can tell me what I need to bring when I go to the county recorder's office." They went inside, and she made supper while he sat at the kitchen table and told her what she needed to know, and they ate together in the lamplight. And afterward they sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the valley, the cattle settling the creek, a coyote somewhere far off making its lonely dissertation, and the stars above them enormous and near. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said. He turned to look at her. In the darkness, his expression was in shadow, and she could mostly only see his eyes, and what was in them was very plain and unmistakable. "I have spent the better part of this summer trying to behave like this is a professional arrangement between us," he said, "because you said that's what it was, and I wanted to respect that. But I think we both know it stopped being only that somewhere around the second or third week." He paused. "I would like to know how you feel about that." Della looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and what she felt was everything she had been feeling for weeks, all of it at once. The tenderness and the admiration and the particular ache of wanting someone who is right there beside you and whom you have been politely not reaching for. "I think," she said carefully, "that it probably stopped being only that the first day when you argued with your horse." He stared at her. "That's when it started for you." "It was compelling," she said solemnly. He laughed again, the full warm laugh that changed his face, and she laughed with him. And when the laughter eased, he reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch step between them. Just held it, no more than that. And she turned her hand over and held his back. And they sat like that in the dark with the stars overhead and the valley below them and something between them that was real and solid and rooted in truth. "Della," he said. "I know," she said. They went to the county recorder's office in Caldwell 2 days later, and she signed the supplementary documents and paid the small fee. And the title to her property was solid and complete, and there was nothing Decker could make of it. Andrew had spoken with the county recorder in advance, and the recorder, who was a straightforward man named Mr. Elias Bright, who had a particular professional distaste for opportunistic land agents, had been quietly thorough in making sure the filing was airtight. When Decker came to make his inquiries later that week, he was informed that the Rhodes property title was in perfect order, and he moved on to easier targets, which was the nature of men like Decker. Della went about her summer, and it was different now, textured differently, colored differently. Andrew came out to the ranch, and the ease between them was still easy, but it was also warm in a way that had nowhere to hide itself, and neither of them was trying to hide it. He held her hand on the porch. He brought her books from town. He told her about the night sky over the Flint Hills, and the names he had learned for the constellations from an old trapper he had traveled with for a season years back. Names that were not the proper Latin names but were better, were stories. And she lay back on the porch boards and looked up at the stories he traced for her with his finger against the black velvet sky. He kissed her for the first time at the end of July, standing by the pump where she had been watering the garden. A clear and unhurried afternoon with the light at that particular summer angle. He had brought her a letter from the county recorder confirming the final completion of the title filing, and she had read it and looked up at him with an expression of pure relief and happiness. And he had looked at her with that winter-water gaze and said, very quietly, "May I?" And she had said yes, and he had kissed her with a gentleness and a care that was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him, which was considerable by now, and which all added up to the same thing. She stood there afterward in the garden with the sunlight on her face and his hand still at her jawline, and she thought very clearly and very precisely that this was the particular something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting, and that it had been worth every year of the waiting. August in the Flint Hills. The grass going from green to gold, the light changing, the days still hot but the mornings carrying in them the first intimations of autumn. Della's herd had grown from 12 to 20, through a careful and well-timed purchase that Andrew had helped her negotiate with a rancher to the south, who was diversifying away from cattle. The ranch had a name now, a name she had given it, Rhodes Valley, which was simple and true and hers. She had neighbors she was getting to know, the McAllister family 3 miles east with their 4 children and their unfailing hospitality, and a widow named Helen Voss who ran a small horse operation to the north, and who had become, over the course of several shared Sunday meals and a great deal of frank conversation, something close to a friend. Helen was 40 years old and entirely self-possessed and had opinions about everything, and Della found her enormously refreshing. Helen's opinion of Andrew Townsend was rendered without hesitation or ambiguity the first time she met him. "He looks at you the way a man looks at something he's afraid of losing," Helen said, watching him across Della's kitchen table one Sunday afternoon. "He's not afraid of things," Della said. "He's afraid of that one thing," Helen said, with great certainty and no further explanation. Della thought about that for several days. She thought about it while she was doing all the things that had become her life in this valley, the morning work and the fence work and the cattle and the garden and the evenings on the porch. She thought about it in the way that you think about something that is confirming something you already know, turning it over to see it from different angles, each angle adding to rather than changing the picture. She asked him about it, eventually, on a September evening when the air was cool for the first time in months, and they were sitting on the porch with cups of coffee and the hills around them were starting to go russet and amber at the edges. "Helen Voss told me something interesting," she said. "Helen Voss has an opinion on everything," he said, without any heat. "She said you look at me the way a man looks at something he's afraid of losing," Della said. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking. Then he said, "She's observant." "Are you afraid of losing me?" Della asked. The question was direct and she meant it to be. He set the coffee cup down and turned to look at her fully, which he always did when a thing was important. He gave things his full face. "I haven't let myself think about it in those specific terms," he said. "But I suppose if I did think about it in those specific terms, the honest answer would be yes." "Why?" she said. "Because what we have here is something I didn't expect," he said. "I've spent most of my adult life being useful to people without particularly belonging anywhere or to anyone. This valley and you in it is the first thing in a long time that has felt like mine in some deep sense. Not mine to own," he added quickly. "Mine the way a home is yours, the way something matters." He paused. "And yes, I'm aware that is a frightening thing to have when you've spent a long time not having it." Della looked at him steadily. "It doesn't have to be frightening," she said. "No," he said. "I'm starting to believe that." She reached over and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers with a warmth and a firmness that felt like something said. In October, Andrew began to spend more nights at the ranch than not, sleeping in the barn initially because propriety in 1882 in Kansas was a real and functional consideration, and Della was aware of it even if it struck her sometimes as an inconvenient one, but also simply because the days had grown too full of work and too short in the light to make the ride back to Caldwell practical every evening. There was a cot in the barn's side room that he set up there, and she didn't comment on the arrangement except to leave coffee on the stove in the mornings and find it gone when she came out, which was its own commentary. It was in October that a difficulty came up that they had not anticipated. A man named Harlan Fitch came to the valley in the middle of October, arriving on a fine horse and with the kind of clothes that were trying a little too hard to say money, and introduced himself as a representative of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company, which was a development company out of Kansas City that was acquiring land in the Flint Hills to consolidate into a larger ranching operation. He was polite in the smooth and frictionless way of men who have rehearsed politeness as a professional skill, and he made Della an offer for Rhodes Valley that was not insulting, but was also not what the land was worth, and both of them knew it. She told him no thank you. He came back 2 weeks later with a higher number and a great deal of talk about how the territory was changing, how the open-range days were ending, how small operations like hers would find it increasingly difficult to remain viable as the large companies moved in. He was not threatening. He was simply rendering, in a pleasant voice, a picture of the future in which her best option was to sell to him now. She told him no thank you again. He left and she sat on the porch for a while afterward, and Andrew came and found her there with an expression that she had learned to recognize as his concerned and waiting to be asked face. "He'll come back," she said. "He might," Andrew said. "Is he right?" she said. "About small operations having trouble staying viable." Andrew sat down beside her. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly rather than telling her what she might want to hear. "The range is changing," he said. "The big companies are real and they're moving in, and some smaller ranches will have trouble, yes, but not all of them. The ones that are run well and have good land and good water and build the right kind of operation have every chance. Rhodes Valley has good land and good water." He paused. "And it's run by the most capable person I've ever met." She looked at him quickly. He was looking straight ahead at the valley, and his profile in the October light was something she had memorized without meaning to, every line and angle of it. "That's what my father said about me," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I heard him say it, and I've watched you this summer, and I have the same assessment." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had never done before and which felt entirely right, and he put his arm around her with a naturalness that suggested he had been waiting to do it for quite some time. "We'll figure out Fitch," she said. "We will," he said, and they did. Over the following weeks, they talked to other small ranchers in the territory, some of whom were facing the same pressure from the same company, and Andrew facilitated a series of conversations between these ranchers, using his knowledge of who was who and who trusted who, and they formed a loose cooperative arrangement among 6 properties in the area that gave them collective leverage on supply costs and market access that none of them had individually. It was not a dramatic confrontation with the Meridian Land and Cattle Company. It was something quieter and more durable, the steady building of a network of people with common interests who were stronger together than apart. Fitch came back one more time in November, and Della told him no for the 3rd and final time, and this time there was a firmness in it that he apparently found entirely convincing, because he did not come back after that. November brought the first snow to the Flint Hills, light and early, a dusting that didn't stick but changed the color of everything to silver and gray and made the air sharp and clean and new. The cattle needed more tending in the cold, and there was wood to cut and stack, and a gap in the barn roof to address before winter truly arrived. And Della and Andrew worked through all of it with the concentrated and efficient partnership that their months together had built. And still, he had not asked her to marry him. She was aware of this in the way that you are aware of a thing that you are waiting for without having explicitly said you are waiting for it. She had no doubt about his feelings, had not had a real doubt about them since the evening he had taken her hand on the porch steps, and she had no doubt about her own, which were deep and settled and not going anywhere. But the asking was a thing that had its own timing, and she found herself content to let it find that timing, because this man had taught her, over the course of a whole summer and autumn, something about the value of letting things arrive in their own way. It arrived in December. It arrived on a cold, clear morning after a night of proper snow that had laid itself across the valley, in a silence so total that she had woken up in the night and lain still for a moment thinking the world had stopped, and then had understood it was just the particular silence of snow, which is the silence of all sound being absorbed and held. She came out in the morning to find the valley transformed, the grass hidden, and the ridges white, and the creek a dark ribbon through all that brightness. Andrew was already up, had been up for a while by the look of it, because the livestock were seen too, and there was coffee on the stove, and he was standing on the porch looking out at the white valley when she came out. He turned when he heard her, and his expression was one she had not seen before, open in a way that he usually held something in reserve on. Every careful layer of the man laid down, and what was underneath was just him, straightforward and sure. He said her name. Just that, just Della, but the way he said it was a whole speech. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple one, gold with a small garnet set in it, not extravagant but chosen with care. You could see the care in it, and he held it and looked at it for a moment and then looked up at her. "I don't have a piece of land to offer you," he said, "because you have that already and it's yours, and that's right. I don't have a great deal of money. What I have is this valley, which you're letting me be part of, and the absolute certainty that the life I have here with you is the best thing I've known." He paused. "I would like to keep being part of it, for all of it, if you would have me." The snow lay on the valley and the light was that particular winter morning light, white and clear and honest. She crossed the porch and took the ring from his hand and looked at it, the small garnet catching the light. And then she looked at him, and what she felt in that moment was so complete and whole that it had no edges to it. "Andrew Townsend," she said, "I found you in a livery stable arguing with a horse, and I have spent the following months discovering that you are the most quietly extraordinary person I have ever known. You have helped me build a life here without once making me feel like I couldn't build it myself." She paused, and something moved through her that was laughter and tears at the same time. "You are also going to have to tell me something." He looked at her, uncertain now. "When we rode out to this valley the first time," she said, "I rode up to the top of that rise and looked down and saw the house and the barn and the land, and I felt like I had found it myself, like it was a discovery." She held the ring lightly. "But you had been out here before. You knew what was down there. You knew it was good. You knew exactly what I was going to see." "Yes," he said carefully. "You left a trail," she said. "Didn't you? Not just that one time, but all of it. The suppliers you pointed me toward. The rancher you knew who was selling cattle, the county recorder and the Decker situation, the other small ranchers for the cooperative. Every time something needed to happen, you knew the right path and you made sure I could find it." She was smiling now. She couldn't stop the smile. "You left breadcrumbs everywhere, Andrew. You made a whole trail through the wilderness, and then you let me walk it and think I was finding my own way." His expression was something she had no word for. It was caught and tender and lit from inside all at once. "You were finding your own way," he said. "I just made sure the way was clear." She laughed. It started as a laugh and kept going, full and genuine, the kind of laughter that comes up from somewhere deep and warm and real. And it went on longer than she expected, because the more she thought about it, the more she saw it. All the quiet and careful work he had done behind the scenes to make sure her path was possible, while making absolutely certain that she was the one walking it. She laughed until her eyes were full, and the laughter shifted somewhere in the middle into something else entirely, something that was still laughter but was also the relief and gratitude and love of it. And she ended up laughing and weeping at the same time, standing on her snow-covered porch with a garnet ring in her hand, and this man looking at her with an expression of such pure and helpless love that it only made her laugh harder. "Don't laugh," he said, though he was smiling. "I cannot stop laughing," she said, wiping her eyes. "Andrew, I found clues you left me. I followed a trail you built. I have been the heroine of my own story this whole time, and you were the one who wrote the landscape." "You were always the heroine," he said. "I just cleared a few rocks off the road." She looked at him through her laughter and her tears and the winter morning light, and she thought that she had never loved anyone as specifically and as completely as she loved him in this exact moment, which was a useful thing to know when a man was holding his breath waiting for an answer. "Yes," she said. He let out the breath. "Yes," she said again, more firmly, and slid the ring onto her finger where it fit exactly right, which was not a coincidence, and she knew it. He had noticed her hands. He had always been noticing things. And she laughed again at that, and he came forward and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his neck and laughed and cried together while the snow of the valley lay quiet around them. He held her for a long time, and when the laughter finally settled, She turned her face up, and he kissed her in the cold morning air with the snow all around them and the coffee still warm on the stove inside. And it was exactly right. They were married in February of 1883 in Caldwell, at the small white church on the north end of town, in a ceremony that was attended by a good number of people who had come to know both of them over the preceding year. Helen Voss was there in a remarkable hat and an expression of proprietary satisfaction, as if she had arranged the entire thing herself. The McAllister family filled an entire pew, all 6 of them, the youngest of the children asleep in her mother's arms for most of it. The county recorder, Mr. Elias Bright, came, in his careful way, and shook Andrew's hand with warmth. Several of the ranchers from their cooperative were there, men and their wives who had become part of the fabric of a life in a way that Della had not expected to find so quickly in new country. Andrew cleaned up extraordinarily well, which she had not had occasion to observe before, and she told him so directly when he met her at the church door, and he said she was not so bad herself, which made her smile in a way that she was aware was making Helen Voss, standing nearby, very pleased with herself. The ceremony was simple, and the words were true, and they said them to each other with the straightforwardness that was the defining quality of everything between them. They went back to Rhodes Valley that evening as husband and wife, riding out of Caldwell in the late afternoon with the winter sky doing something extraordinary in peach and gold to the west, and when they rode up over the familiar rise and looked down at the valley, the house and the barn and the frozen creek and the cattle in the pasture and the snow on the ridges, Della pulled her horse up for a moment and just looked at it. Andrew stopped beside her. "Still beautiful," he said. "Every time," she said. He reached over and took her hand without letting go of his reins, and they looked at the valley together in the fading light, and it was entirely theirs. The spring of 1883 came in stages the way springs do in Kansas, hesitantly at first and then all at once, the grass green and insistent, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt from the hills to the north. Della and Andrew had gotten through the winter together in the ranch house, which had been warm and full and entirely good, and as the world greened up around them, they made plans for the ranches next year with the ease of 2 people who have learned each other's thinking and trust it. Della was good with the business side of the operation, the numbers and the planning and the negotiations, and she had a particular talent for reading people that made her formidable in any conversation involving money. Andrew was good with the land and the cattle and the larger logistics, the seasonal knowledge, the understanding of when and how the range changed and what it needed and how to stay ahead of problems. Together they were better than either of them was alone, which was not always true of partnerships and was, when it was true, something to be deeply grateful for. They expanded the herd to 40 head by May through careful and patient acquisition. They added a second section of fencing to the eastern pasture. Andrew built a new chicken coop on the south side of the barn, which Della had been asking for since October. She planted a larger garden this year, with seeds she had ordered from a catalog, and which arrived in a small brown paper parcel that felt like a promise, and she put in tomatoes and beans and squash, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that were entirely decorative and entirely worth it. Helen Voss came to dinner every Sunday that summer, reliably and unapologetically, and Della was grateful for it, for the friendship and the conversation and Helen's frank opinions on every subject under the Kansas sun. Andrew had eventually won Helen's approval through the simple and effective method of being genuinely useful to her horse operation on 2 occasions when problems arose, and the approval was expressed by Helen in the form of stopping her commentary on him being good enough for Della and starting to include him in the conversations as a peer, which was, from Helen Voss, the highest honor available. In the early fall of 1883, Della and Andrew learned that they were expecting a child. Della had been fairly certain for several weeks before she said anything, moving the knowledge around in her interior like a piece of furniture she was working out where to place. She told Andrew on an October morning while they were at the breakfast table, with the directness that was always her way. He sat very still for a moment, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then he set it down and looked at her, and his face did the thing it did when something was too large for his usual careful management, when everything he felt came entirely to the surface. "You are," he said. "I am," she said. He stood up and came around the table to her, and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment and then pressed his forehead to hers and said, very quietly, "Thank you," which was not the typical thing to say and was entirely him. The months of the pregnancy were the months of the ranch continuing its work, because cattle did not take seasons off, and fence did not mend itself, and a life required the tending it required. Della worked through the fall and the early winter with the practical determination that was her nature, accepting the limits of what she could physically do as they developed without making too much of them, accepting Andrew's quiet and attentive care without making too much of that either. He was present in the way she needed, which was not hovering or fussing but being there, being reliably there, making sure that the things she would have done herself were done without her having to ask, and without being made to feel that she needed the help. She had expressed, early in their marriage, how important it was to her to remain capable and autonomous within the partnership, and he had understood that precisely and completely and honored it, which was why the partnership worked. Helen Voss delivered the baby, which was a March event, a cold and windy March night with the stars out between the clouds and the fire in the main room burning high and well. Andrew was, for the first and only time in Della's experience, unable to maintain his composure. He paced the porch in the cold for 2 hours while Helen and the neighboring Mrs. McAllister were inside, and when Della, afterward, was told about the pacing, she found it entirely endearing and told him so. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas, for her father, which felt like the most natural thing in the world, and Thomas Rhodes Townsend arrived in the world with a full set of opinions about it that he wasted no time expressing. Andrew held his son in the early morning light after the long night, sitting in the chair by the fire with Thomas in the crook of his arm, and the look on his face was something Della watched from the bed and held close for the rest of her life, the absolute and undefended tenderness of a man who is fully met by love in a form he had never anticipated. "He looks like you," Andrew said. "He does not," she said. "He looks like a very small person who has not yet decided what he looks like." Andrew laughed softly so as not to startle the baby. "He does have your stubbornness already, I can tell." "That's a virtue," she said. "I know," he said. "It's his greatest asset." Thomas grew into his face and his opinions over the spring and summer of 1884. And what he grew into was a baby of irresistible charm and relentless energy, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and an expression of focused curiosity that both his parents found simultaneously exhausting and wonderful. The ranch absorbed him as it had absorbed everything else, as another element of its life, and Thomas spent his first year of existence being carried about the property in various practical ways, while the work continued around and alongside his existence. The cooperative that Andrew had helped form had grown from 6 ranches to 9 by 1884, and had developed into something with its own structure and regular meetings, a practical mutual aid arrangement that gave each of its members access to shared resources and market knowledge that was making real differences to the viability of small operations in the changing landscape of the Kansas cattle country. Della was one of the most active voices in its meetings, which were held on a rotating basis at different properties, and she had a reputation in those rooms for clear thinking and direct speech that made her contributions valued. The Meridian Land and Cattle Company, which had been acquiring properties across the territory, had indeed bought out several smaller ranches, but it had not made another approach to Rhodes Valley, and Della believed that was partly because of the cooperative and partly because the property had developed into something that was clearly well managed and well established, which made it a less easy acquisition. She also believed it was partly because of Andrew's relationships across the territory, the way he was known and respected, which gave the operation a certain standing that pure acreage and cattle numbers alone could not. She told him that once, directly and deliberately, because she believed in saying true things to the people they were about. She told him that his knowledge and his reputation and his network had been as much a part of building Rhodes Valley as the fencing and the cattle. He deflected this with characteristic modesty, and she told him that she was not inviting a debate. She was stating a fact, and he smiled at her with those winter-water eyes and said he heard her, and she knew that he had. The summer of 1885 brought a new neighbor to the valley, a family named the Garcias who had come up from Texas, recent immigrants from Mexico, parents and 3 children, and a grandmother who sat on her chair outside their modest house and watched the horizon with ancient eyes and gave Della, the first time they met, a piece of advice about growing chilies that she used for the rest of her life. The family had a hard early time, navigating the particular hostilities that the territory could produce toward people perceived as outsiders, and Andrew and Della were vocal in their support and their welcome, inviting the Garcia family into the cooperative and into the regular Sunday dinner table without making a speech about it, because making a speech about ordinary decency was itself a kind of condescension, and both of them knew that. They were not naive about the injustices in the country around them. The displacement of the native peoples who had called the Flint Hills home for generations before any of this was a weight that sat in the landscape itself, in the bones of the land, and you had to be willfully blind not to feel it. Andrew had a particular awareness of it from his years in the territory and his relationships with families like the Pawnee ones he had helped, and Della had come to share that awareness through him and through the country itself, through what you learned when you listened to the land and its history. They could not fix those injustices. They could be honest about them and be decent in their small sphere and refuse to participate in the systems that perpetuated them. And they did those things as consistently as they could. In 1886, the summer when Thomas was 3 years old and had developed an obsession with the chickens that bordered on the clinical, Della discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Andrew the same morning she was certain, and his response was the same composed and helpless love as the first time, which she had counted on and which did not disappoint. This baby was a girl, arriving in November with her father's dark hair and her grandmother's tenacity, and they named her Ruth, because of the book in the Bible where her grandfather had tucked the deed to this valley, and because Ruth had followed where she was led and made a life in new country through loyalty and courage, and had been met by a kindness that matched her own, and the story had seemed, from the beginning, to have something to say about all of them. Ruth was quieter than Thomas and more watchful, and she had, by the time she was old enough to walk, a clear and decided preference for the barn and the horses, which she approached without fear, and with a steadiness that made the horses calm around her in a way that was almost uncanny. Andrew watched this with an expression of deep delight. He began her actual horse education when she was 4, in the patient and respectful way that he did everything. And by 5, she was riding in the paddock on a small gray pony that had been purchased specifically for her, and had been given the name Cecily II by Thomas, who found this hilarious. The roan mare, original Cecily, was aging gracefully and still had opinions about everything, and was still in residence at the ranch, beloved and entirely aware of it. In the evenings, in those years of the middle 1880s, after the children were in bed and the work of the day was done, Della and Andrew sat on the porch, or by the fire depending on the season, and talked in the way they had always talked, wide and deep and honest, moving between the practical and the personal and the philosophical with the ease of 2 people who have learned each other's minds and enjoy the landscape of them. He had started writing again in those years. She had discovered this when she found pages of it in his handwriting on the kitchen table one morning, stories and observations and descriptions of the land and the light and the people in it, written in that cramped hand she knew so well. When she asked him about it, he seemed briefly uncertain, as if she might find it impractical or strange, and she picked up the pages and read 3 of them while he watched and then set them down and told him flatly that it was good, that he should continue, and that she expected to read all of it, and his expression said everything she needed to know about what that meant to him. She had her own books in those years too, a lending library of sorts that she maintained through the cooperative's network, books making their way from ranch to ranch across the territory in a kind of informal circulation that she had started by accident and that had grown into its own thing. It gave her great pleasure. The book that came back to her most worn, most obviously read by many hands, was a novel, and it came back one winter with a note from a woman she barely knew who wrote that she had stayed up until midnight to finish it, and it had made her feel less alone. Della had kept that note for a long time. In 1887, Rhodes Valley's herd reached 80 head. Andrew had by then formalized his role in the operation, not as a hired hand, which had never really been the right description, but as a full partner in the ranch, which had always been the truth of it, and the change in how the paperwork described things was an alignment of paper reality with lived reality, which satisfied something in both of them. They were known in the county and beyond it as a well-run operation with good judgment, and when new families came into the territory looking to start something and needing guidance, they were often directed to Rhodes Valley, to the woman with the brown eyes that could read your intentions, and the man who knew the hills better than anyone and who would help you find your way if you asked him without making you feel like you needed the help. Della smiled every time she heard that description, because it was precisely right, and she knew it better than anyone. Thomas, at 5, was intensely interested in cattle and numbers, and the mechanics of how the ranch made money, which Andrew encouraged with great patience by explaining things in full and genuine detail, treating the 5-year-old's questions as the serious inquiries they were in their small way. Ruth, at 2, was interested in horses and in what the birds were doing, and in a small gray striped cat that had appeared at the barn in the spring, and who appeared to have decided that the cat life at Rhodes Valley was acceptable and had stayed. One spring morning in 1888, Della was in the garden with Thomas when her son looked up at her with the particular expression he had that meant a thought was arriving, a kind of interior concentration that was exactly his father's. "Mama," he said, "did you really find this ranch yourself?" She paused in what she was doing, her hands in the earth. She looked at her son, who was 5 years old and had his father's hair and her eyes and a mind that was already asking the questions that mattered. She thought about how to answer. "I found it," she said, "and I also had help finding it. Do you know what the difference is between those two things?" He considered this gravely. "No," he said. "When you have a good person helping you," she said, "they don't carry you to where you're going. They make sure the road is clear so you can walk it yourself. You still walk it, you still arrive." She looked at the house and the barn and the valley around them. "This is mine, and it's also something your father helped make possible. Both of those things are true at the same time." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "So finding something yourself and having help are the same?" "They can be," she said, "if the help is the right kind." He seemed satisfied with this, which satisfied her. That evening she told Andrew what Thomas had asked and what she had said, and Andrew listened and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with that directness he reserved for the things that mattered most, "That's the most generous thing I've heard anyone say." "It's accurate," she said. "You could have said many other things," he said. "You could have said he led you by the nose through the whole first year." She laughed. "You didn't lead me by the nose. You cleared rocks off the road. There's a difference." He looked at her across the kitchen table with those winter-water eyes that she had known now for 6 years, and that still did the thing to her that they had done that first day in the livery stable, the thing that was a settling and a rising at the same time, and he said, "I love you, Della Rhodes Townsend." "I know," she said. "I love you too, insufferably much. I want to register a complaint about how much. Complaint registered, he said. I'm going to keep on loving you anyway, she said. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. The valley was greening around them in the spring of 1888, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the children were in their beds, and the creek was running its old conversation over the stones, and the stars were out over the Flint hills in their impossible abundance. Della and Andrew sat on the porch as they always did, in the old comfortable way that had never lost its warmth, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And outside the house that her father had left her, and the life she had built and the trail she had followed that was also always her own, the world went on in its beautiful and complex way, full of trouble and full of grace. She thought about her father with his Bible and his deed tucked behind the book of Ruth, about a man who had looked at this valley from exactly this rise and said it was beautiful country and hoped someone would make something of it. She thought about the morning she had arrived in Caldwell with $43 and a carpet bag, and a stubbornness her mother had always called her greatest virtue. She thought about a livery stable and a roan mare with opinions, and a man who argued with horses and read poetry with the margins filled in. She thought about riding up to the top of a rise and looking down at a valley and feeling like she had discovered something entirely on her own, and the later discovery that the man beside her had known it was beautiful and had said nothing and let her find it for herself, had built a trail of breadcrumbs through a whole year of her life without her seeing the breadcrumbs, only the path, only the arriving. The laughter came up again even now, the same laughter from that December morning in the snow, full and warm from somewhere real. Andrew turned to look at her, feeling her shoulders shake. "What?" he said. "The breadcrumbs," she said. "Still," he said. "Always," she said and laughed, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out into the valley, and the valley held it, and the stars went on overhead, and the life they had built together in this place was all around them, solid and living and completely theirs. Thomas Rhodes Townsend grew up to run the ranch with his father, and eventually to expand it into one of the most respected small operations in the county. A man with his father's knowledge of the land and his mother's sharpness with numbers and both his parents' stubborn decency. Ruth Townsend grew up to be the finest horsewoman in 3 counties, which no one who had watched her at 4 years old standing steady in the paddock would have found surprising at all. She eventually partnered with a woman named Clara Garcia, the daughter of their neighbors, in a horse breeding operation that was something genuinely new and genuinely hers. Cecily the roan mare lived to an age that the local veterinarian found remarkable, and which Andrew found entirely unsurprising, saying only that Cecily had always had very strong opinions about her own longevity. Cecily II was a good pony and a patient teacher, and served several generations of small riders in the valley before retiring to a life of complete leisure and apparent self-satisfaction. Helen Voss came to Sunday dinners for many years and gave her opinions freely, and was deeply loved, and never stopped being right about most things. Andrew's writing eventually found its way into a Caldwell newspaper, and from there to a wider readership, observations and stories about the Flint Hills and the people in them. And Della read every word and told him when it was good and told him when it was less good, and he took both observations with equal seriousness, and the work was better for it. And every spring when the grass came back green, and the light changed over the Flint Hills, and the valley opened like a hand below the familiar rise, Della Rhodes Townsend looked down at it with the same feeling she had felt the first time, the feeling of having found something entirely and completely her own, which she had, which it was. And the trail of breadcrumbs through the wilderness of that first year, the cleared rocks and the known path and the man who had made sure she could walk it without ever making her feel like she had been led, remained the most romantic thing she had ever known, a love expressed not in grand gestures but in 100 quiet ones, in the giving of discovery to someone you believed in stepping back so they could step forward, in making sure the way was clear, and then watching with a full heart as they found their way home.